If you'd like to take your Bible and turn to Genesis chapter 13. Tonight we will be considering Abram and Lot. This is a series that some of the men in the church are leading whilst Tom is away. The series is on the life of Abraham. The first two parts were back in June. Hugh began the series with looking at the first half of chapter 12 and the call of Abraham. And the next week, Colin led the second part, the second half of chapter 12, looking at Abraham in Egypt. And so tonight we come to the third part, Genesis chapter 13, Abram and Lot. So we'll read the whole of chapter 13. Genesis 13, verse 1. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanite and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right, or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you." Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. As we study this chapter this evening, the topic that I want to impress on your minds is the importance of God's people living distinctive and separate lives from the world. And under this topic, I plan to make 3 points from this chapter. Firstly, it is a matter of being obedient to God's will. Secondly, that worldliness compromises our discipleship of other believers. And thirdly, we must remember that the world is watching. So, diving into the first point. It is distinctive living is a matter of obedience to God's will. The separation of Abram and Lot is an event that God wanted to bring about. If you look back in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, and the call to Abraham, it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to the land that I will show you.'" And so far, Abram has mostly complied with this. He has left his homeland, the land of Ur, and he's left behind most of his father's family, but his nephew Lot is still with him. He is with him all throughout chapter 12, and including when Abram is down in Egypt. That is clear from chapter 13, verse 1, when as Abram returns, it says that Lot was with him. Lot was returning with him. And so in chapter 13, God is orchestrating events to bring about their separation. He is giving them the push to part. Ultimately, it is God who gave them the wealth that they acquired in Egypt. The land that they came to was such that it could not support both of them. This mirrors our own call. I began by reading from Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, where it talks about us being called out of the power of darkness and into the kingdom of the Son. And there are numerous other verses in the New Testament about how we have been transferred from one place or state to another. To give you one more example, John chapter 15, the upper room discourse, when Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he says in verses 18 and 19, "If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." So we read there that we have been chosen out of the world. We, like Abram, have been called from our former life, called to leave it all behind and to live an entirely new life in service to God. Partial obedience, such as is seen in Abram here, is the same as disobedience. He has not yet complied with the will of God. And in our walk, we must we can either act obediently to God's will and give up the things in our former life, or if we don't, and if we walk in disobedience, we must remember that ultimately they will be prized away. God may orchestrate events in our lives so that we are forced to separate from these things, or maybe we will keep these things until the day that we die, but they will be prized away from us in the heavenly kingdom. As we think about Abram and Lot, the chapters here in Genesis don't tell us much about their relationship. When Lot's father dies and he becomes an orphan, we don't know if it's Abram that clings to Lot or Lot that clings to Abram. Maybe from Lot's point of view, it's that Abram is his favourite uncle and the one that he wants to follow and spend time with, and Abram has been unable to shake off his nephew. Or perhaps Abram looks at Lot, his nephew, his orphan nephew, with pity and compassion and takes him under his wing to be a mentor and father figure to him. The Bible doesn't tell us which way round it is, but regardless of that, there are useful applications for us either way, whether it is us clinging to some sin or some part of the world, our former life that still clings to us. Whichever way round it is, there is a call, a command from God to let go of it, to leave it behind. Disobedience in this matter only leads to us robbing ourselves of joy and communion with God and our strength to continue. It has often been said that faith is like a muscle, and the more we exercise it, the stronger it gets. And the opposite is true. When we don't exercise faith, or when we don't exercise a muscle, then it atrophies, it becomes weaker over time. We will see this in the second point, the effects of disobedience and the robbing, the losing of joy and strength with God. Also, remember that disobedience brings dishonour to God before the nations. How, when we fail to live as we are called, the world around us will not see us as any different. And we will see this played out in the third point. So, that's the first point. Distinctive Christian living is a matter of obedience to God's will. Secondly, worldliness compromises our discipleship of other believers. Let's think about Lot. I don't know about you, but when I read Genesis and consider the book just by itself, a question that I come away with is Lot a believer? The Bible gives us a definitive answer to this question in 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. This is speaking of God delivering righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, that's those in Sodom. For that righteous man, dwelling among them, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. 3 times in 2 verses, Peter uses the word righteous to describe Lot. So whenever we read of Lot in Genesis, through his ups and downs, and it does seem to be mostly downs, we must remember that at the end of the day, he is saved. He is a believer. So, knowing this about Lot, let's consider Lot's knowledge of God. While we have the whole Bible, all of God's revealed scripture to us, Lot had about that much. I don't know if it was written down in his time. Maybe it was just oral stories passed down from generation to generation. So aside from this limited knowledge of God, he also had an example in Abram, his uncle, one whom God had spoken to directly. And I want you to see, to draw out here, how the actions, the sinful actions of Lot in choosing the land of Jordan and the land around Sodom mirror the actions of Abram back in chapter 12. I just want to note here that generally in Genesis, Abraham is a good example. He is held up to us as a man of faith and one whom we should emulate. But here we see a bad example of Abram. And when I talk about the bad example of Abram, I'm limiting my thought to chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. But let's see how Lot is following Abram's example. Abram is faced with a trial. He's in the land of Canaan, and there's a famine in the land, and there is food in the next country, in the nearby country of Egypt. And so it seems only natural, only logical that Abram would go to where the food is. When it comes to Lot and the separation from Abram, Lot looks around and sees that the land toward the Jordan and Sodom and Gomorrah is the pasture there is plentiful and good for feeding flocks and herds. So it is only natural that he should choose that land. Neither man in these situations makes any reference or appeal to God for guidance in how to act in these situations. And furthermore, they both ignore the known sins or issues with the local population. When Abram goes down to Egypt, he goes knowing that the Egyptians have a habit of taking beautiful women and just carting them away to be married off to pharaohs or other nobles. So he makes a plan to work around this. Genesis chapter 13, verse 13 tells us, "The men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord." Now all people and all people groups sin against the Lord, but the Bible makes clear time and again that the sins of the people of Sodom are particularly heinous. They reach new lows in their depravity. We read from 2 Peter how their speech and their actions vexed Lot's soul. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the events in Genesis chapter 19, and it is clear there that their sins, they commit them openly in the streets. They talk about them, they boast about them, they commit them in the streets. It is no secret what happens in Sodom. And so Genesis chapter 13, verse 13 is there to remind us that when Lot is making the decision about which portion of the land to move into, he goes knowing full well what happens in Sodom. And either he is foolish in thinking that the behavior of the Sodomites doesn't matter, or maybe there's an element of pride and he looks back to what happened in Egypt. Abram made a plan to work around this habit of the Egyptians, and things worked out well for them. They came out with lots of wealth. And so he thinks that he could maybe, the Bible doesn't tell us, but maybe he thinks he could make a plan to work around the men of Sodom, and that things would work out well for him in the end. So Lot is following Abram's bad example. And we, as Christians, must think of the example that we set to the believers around us. There are numerous good examples in the New Testament and that we can follow. We, as a church, in these Thursday night studies, went through the book of Titus not so long ago, and we read there of Paul's exhortation for young men, for older disciples, to train and teach and instruct younger men, and for older women to similarly do so for younger women. So we have there positive examples. Elsewhere, he gives advice and guidance for matters of when Christians have slightly different beliefs. For instance, in Romans 14, when he talks about those in the church who eat meat versus those who have strictly vegetarian diets, and there's the law of love and there, or 1 Corinthians 8, and whether or not it is right to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and how, although generally we can eat meat sacrificed to idols, if you are with a believer, a brother who believes it is sinful to do so, then we should abstain, setting a good example to the believers around us, not leading them into what they believe is sin. And here in Genesis chapter 13 we have a negative example, and this has tragic consequences for Lot. I just want to take some time to do a brief overview of the life of Lot as set out for us in Genesis. In chapter 12, he leaves his homeland with Abram and goes down into Egypt and gains a lot of wealth there. Chapter 13, as we've read, he separates from Abram. Chapter 14, he almost immediately gives up the nomadic herding lifestyle and settles in the city of Sodom. There is then war in the land. A group of kings from the north make war with a group of kings from the south, and in the middle of this war, Lot is taken captive. But Abram hears of his captivity, and Abram leads his men on a rescue mission which is successful and rescues Lot and all his possessions. Then we do not hear of Lot until Genesis chapter 19, when he is in the city of Sodom, when the Sodomites come and demanding that that Lot should let them gang rape the two angels, men who had come to, angels appearing as men who had come to visit Lot. Lot flees with his family. His wife looks back, is turned to a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters take refuge in a cave in the mountains, and there his daughters hatch an awful plan whereby they get their father drunk, and the oldest daughter has sexual relations with Lot, and in the course of things she becomes pregnant, and then even worse, the plan is repeated the second night with the second daughter. When we consider Lot's life like this, here Genesis chapter 13 is the high point of Lot's life, both spiritually and materially. Genesis 13 is when he is with Abram. We do not read of Lot having any companionship with any other believer. Here in Genesis 13, Lot has his freedom. Lot has his wealth. And all of these things are gradually taken away from Lot, following his foolish, sinful choice, following the example of his uncle Abram. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 12. Paul writes, "And when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ." So it was sinful for Lot to make the choice to journey to dwell in the land around Sodom. But we see here another facet in the sin of Abram going down to Egypt, and how it now plays out with Lot following his example, Lot following Abram's example and decision making. Abram is not responsible for the sins of Lot going down to Egypt, but he does bear sin for the poor example that he sets. So we too must consider the example that we set to our brothers and sisters around us. So that's my second point. Remember how and consider how worldliness compromises our discipleship of other believers. Thirdly, we must remember that the world is watching how we live. Look again at Genesis 13 and verse 7. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So take the second half of that verse. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. This is there to remind us that there are people already in the land, and that as Lot and Abram and Lot come back with their vast amount of wealth, these local people are naturally going to take note of them. They're going to look to them, maybe looking for opportunities. They want to form alliances or maybe make some trade deals, gain a favour or two. Maybe they look on Abram and Lot with fear and their vast wealth and influence. However it is, they take note of these two men. They are watching them and taking note of their conduct. And initially their conduct looks no different from anyone else, as they are there and they are now struggling and arguing with each other. Consider how the world around them goes on to take note of Abram and Lot. We've mentioned in the next chapter that Lot is taken into captivity with the other men of Sodom. The conquering kings see nothing different in Lot. He is just another man of Sodom. Or Genesis chapter 19, which I've referenced a few times. The men of Sodom, the two angels have come to Lot. Lot has offered them shelter. And the men of Sodom now come and bang on Lot's door, demanding that he bring out these men, that the crowd may know them carnally, as it says in verse 5. And then look at verse 9. And they, that is the crowd, and they said, "Stand back." Then they said, "This one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Notice the phrase there, he keeps acting as a judge. This is presumably not the first time that Lot has taken a stand for God and his ways. But the Sodomites seem to take no notice. They take no notice here. They seem to have taken no notice in the past. It seems to me that Lot is like a Christian who has embraced the philosophy of that in order to win the world, we must be like the world. But ultimately, all that happens is the world does not change, but the Christian becomes more world-like. In some cases, like here in Lot, God will preserve them. God will not allow them to be completely taken over by the world. But nonetheless, their behaviour does not conform to the pattern that we are called to by God. And the effect of this is that the world has no respect for Lot. They see him just as one of their own. There is nothing different about him. Contrast that with Abram. The great hall of fame in Hebrews chapter 11, and in verse 9 we read of Abram, "By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, with heirs, the heirs with him of the same promise." Abram adopts a very distinctive lifestyle, it tells us here. Living as in a foreign country. He is dwelling in tents when the pattern of people in Genesis seems to be moving towards city dwelling and settling in one place. The story of Genesis also teaches us how the people view Abram. We are considering chapter 13, but if you scan ahead to chapter 14, Lot has been taken captive, but one of his men escapes and brings news to Abram. In Genesis 14, verse 13, we read, "Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, then they were allies with Abram." Did you catch the phrase there? Abram the Hebrew. We perhaps can be over familiar with the Bible, and we read Abram the Hebrew and think, yes, he's the father of the Hebrew people, and just move on. But take note of this phrase, Abram the Hebrew. It is the first time in the Bible that the word Hebrew is used, and it is often beneficial and instructive to take note and consider the first time a particular name, word, place, event occurs in the Bible. Here, it seems to be a description of Abram that is in common use among the people. The people in the land, they describe him as Abram the Hebrew. There is no other people called Hebrews at this time. They look at Abram with his distinctive, unique way of living, and they ascribe to him an entirely new people group. They look at him, it is as though they look at him and say, well, he came from Ur, but he's not like the other Chaldeans that passed through. He was in Egypt, but he's not like the other Egyptians. He's not like the Canaanites, he's not like the Perizzites, he's not like the Sodomites. We'll give him this new name, Hebrew. The world noticed his distinctive living, and that is a challenge for us. Are our lives so distinctive that the world takes note of the people group that we belong to? Not that we're a new people, but that we are Christian, that we are God's people. Now, the actions alone are not enough. The Bible makes clear that we are to speak to others about our faith. We are to have a defense prepared for it. We are to preach and declare the word of God. But at the same time, our actions must also be in obedience to God. They must have this distinctive Christian living. When our actions do not match up to when our actions do not match up to our words, the world is very quick to label us as hypocrites. So the world is watching. Are our lives distinctive? But before we come to end, I just want us to consider the wonderful grace of God. Genesis chapter 13, verse 14. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward." And then God goes on to reiterate and reaffirm the promises that he had made to Abram beforehand. Abram's disobedience in going down to Egypt has not voided, has not nullified the promises that God had made. God is gracious and faithful. God promises Abram many descendants. God, as we know, I'm guessing most of us are familiar with the story of Genesis and how God prospers Abram. He does so despite the fact that Here, Abram appears to have the second-rate portion of the land. Our God is gracious and he is able to prosper us, to keep us. He keeps all his promises. But also, I want us to consider the grace shown to Lot. Firstly, Lot is preserved in Sodom. We read from 2 Peter how Lot is righteous, how despite all the terrible wicked deeds of the men of Sodom, how God preserves Lot during that time and brings him into his heavenly kingdom. But God also shows grace to Lot by in the descendants of Lot. I mentioned how Lot's 2 daughters hatch a plan and each become pregnant by their father. Each daughter gives birth to a son. You may recognize their names. The firstborn son is called Moab, from whom come the Moabite people. The second son is called Ben-Ami, and from him came the Ammonite people. Now, both these peoples, they go on to become nations in the area around Israel, and they do at various times make trouble and war with the nation of Israel. But if you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 2, here we have Israel wandering in the desert, and God gives them instructions for when they return to the land. In verse 9 it says, "Then the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, nor contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession." Skip ahead to verse 19. "And when you come near the people of Ammon, do not harass them or meddle with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the descendants of Lot as a possession." We see the grace of God shown to Lot here, in that for a short time his descendants, those 2 nations that come from him, are given protection by God from the Israelites. And finally, a third aspect of the grace shown to Lot. Lot is the father of the Moabite nations. There's one particular famous Moabite by the name of Ruth. We read in the book of Ruth how she becomes part of the Israel people. We read in the New Testament genealogies how the line of Christ, how she is in the line to Christ. So Ruth being in the line to Christ, and Lot being an ancestor of Ruth, means that ultimately Lot is an ancestor of Christ. Our Lord and Saviour came through Lot, through his descendants. And we serve this same God. We serve the same God who shows the grace to both Abram and Lot, who is able to make us prosper, maybe not materially, but certainly spiritually, who is able to keep us despite all the trials in the world around us, despite all our mistakes and sins. God shows such wonderful grace to us. So, to conclude, as we've studied Genesis 13 and the Abram and Lot and the story of their separation, and we've considered the importance of us, God's people, living distinctive Christian lives, considering firstly that it is a matter of obedience to God's will, secondly, how worldliness compromises our discipleship of other believers, thirdly, we must remember that the world is watching and takes note of our actions, and we've ended by seeing the wonderful grace of God shown to us. Now, if you'd like to take your hymn books, and we will sing hymn 106, one of my personal favourites, Great is Thy Faithfulness. Can I draw your attention to verse 3? As we've been considering the wonderful grace and faithfulness of God to us, verse 3 says, "Pardon for sin and a peace that endureth, thy own dear presence to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow, blessings all mine with 10,000 beside."